on this edition of NTD's International Reporters Roundtable, Faith Under Attack. Falun Dafa practitioners, targets of the CCP, inside and outside of China. Christians and Catholics isolated by the government, ostracized in their own communities, and people of the Jewish faith facing a reemergence of anti-Semitism not seen in decades. Our guests, Levi Browdy, Arlene Bridges Samuels, and Bill Donahue, join us to discuss the persecution of spiritual believers. Welcome to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Faith under attack. That will be our discussion today. Is there a global strategy to suppress religious followers of all denominations, practitioners of Falun Dafa, a peaceful meditation-based faith imprisoned and tortured in China since 1999, brutally murdered for their organs, now being detained in Russia and elsewhere? Christians already persecuted around the world, in China, Africa, and the Middle East, increasingly being targeted within North America, isolated by the media, their churches burned down. Jewish people tragically murdered in the Holocaust, starting with the horrific event that took place on October 7th in Israel, are now seeing a huge resurgence in anti-Semitism, especially in violent uprisings on American college campuses. How are these faith-based groups being isolated and vilified? What are the tools and mediums being used, and who's ultimately behind it? In the United States, there's been a call to eliminate this profound line from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The war on faith. Why now? Time to meet our panel. Bill Donahue, the president and CEO of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. Bill has appeared on thousands of TV and radio shows speaking on civil liberties, social issues, and religion. The winner of several teaching awards, he's the author of 11 books, thousands of articles, and a columnist for Newsmax.com. And Arlene Bridges Samuels, an advocate for Israel for 25 years. She's traveled to the country over 20 times as a writer, speaker, consultant, and networker. As director of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, she worked towards a strong U.S.-Israel bipartisan relationship in the United States Congress. She's the co-editor of the Auschwitz album, Revisited, and currently a weekly columnist for the Christian Broadcast Network. Levi Browdy, the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, an organization dedicated to ending the human rights abuses against Falun Gong practitioners in China. He's frequently quoted in major media outlets. He's also the producer of the short film, Defiance in the Kingdom of Fake News. It's great to have all of our guests. Levi, we'll begin with you. On the heels of World Falun Dafa Day, May 13th, can you briefly share with us the importance of Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong, to the world?
Well, I think one thing people don't know about Falun Dafa, especially amidst the persecution of the last quarter century, is that back in the 1990s, in the early 90s, it was first introduced to the public after being taught for millennia in that country. And throughout the 1990s, it was widely popular. Upwards of 100 million people were practicing in China. And so the enormous impact of this practice that's encouraging people to live by principles of truthfulness, compassion, forbearance on Chinese society is very difficult to overstate. It was transforming families and communities and just really had an enormous impact on that country. And so when the decision by the communist leaders in 1999, primarily because the practice had become so popular, to reverse course, they had supported it beforehand, but to reverse course and decide to launch a nationwide persecution campaign, it not only targeted Falun Gong, but it tore apart communities across the country and really did irreparable harm to the country, and also as that country was joining the world community and a bigger role in the world stage, the ripple effects of this are really worldwide.
Bill, if you could touch upon the situation in China for many religious believers, Catholics as well, that have to go underground. And also, as president of the Catholic League, you've dedicated your life to fighting against the deterioration of the Catholic faith in our own country. Atheism now more prevalent than ever. How alarming is this as well?
Unfortunately, Pope Francis has been too willing to work with the communist rulers. And by that, I mean that he's not really standing up for the rights of the Chinese Catholics. Cardinal Zen has been outspoken about this, what's going on. I'm not doubting the motives of the Pope, but I'm saying he's a failure in what he's done with the Chinese Catholics. They don't want to be underground. They want to thrive like everybody else. But this regime is out there to punish them. And the idea that you're going to have the communists help pick the next bishop, it's none of their business for the state in any country to pick the clergy of any religion. But this Pope has been weak. It's one of the worst aspects of his pontificate. And of course, in this country, yeah, we've got an awful lot to talk about.
Arlene, I want to get your thoughts. You've been a great friend to Israel and the Jewish people around the world for decades. The October 7th attacks were incredibly shocking. From your perspective, the situation they are in now, are you surprised?
I must say that I am not surprised, because I have been following the history of the Jewish people from ancient times, understanding that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has preserved them all these years, even during and after the Holocaust. Now we are facing another issue where, because of social media now, we all in the world understand or see what is going on since the Hamas attack. Of course, we know that the Islamic regime, Iran, they're behind all of their proxies. They are behind what is going on against Israel. But it extends farther, as you said, Steve, to us as Christians. I am a Christian Zionist. I am a person who believes that the Bible says that Jews are the indigenous people in the land of Israel, and that makes Israel my spiritual homeland.
Levi, Arlene touched upon social media. I want to ask you about the media at large, both inside of China and outside of China. You've investigated and put some information forth on the New York Times and how they may be exacerbating the persecution inside of China. Tell us how the media has played a role in the persecution of Falun Dafa.
Well, I think it largely breaks down into two categories. One is omission and the other is disinformation. And omission, it's usually not thought of as part of the disinformation campaign, but it really is a huge part. And that is, most of us don't, live in China or live in Gaza or Israel and all these other places where all this tremendous news is happening. And so we rely entirely upon the media to formulate our opinions, to formulate our worldview. And if you look at certainly the New York Times has led the way, but really mainstream media more broadly, there has been a deafening silence to the detaining and torture and killing of Falun Gong practitioners throughout China, as there has been to other dissidents and other religious minorities in China. And that omission makes the persecution of these people of faith just not exist. And that's a huge problem when you're trying to talk to human rights groups and policymakers in the United States and other democracies to do something about it. And so the omission is a big problem. The second problem is the vilification, the disinformation, the idea that you take a group of faith-based group and what little reporting you do about them is not really about the suffering they're experiencing at the hands of tyrannical regimes. It's sort of caricatures and vilifications of what they believe and their community as a faith-based group. And so you put those two together, no reporting of persecution, a mockery of what they believe and who they are, and it's a very toxic mix in terms of what is happening to people of faith, certainly Falun Gong in China, but people of faith around the world.
Bill, I'm sure you can weigh in on the media. Just recently here, Harrison Butker, the Kansas City Chiefs player there, he's coming under a pretty harsh barrage stemming from what you might say the media for his beliefs.
Right. I'm glad that we led the way in his defense. What he said was simply a restatement of traditional moral Catholic theology. He's a traditionalist. So am I. People want to disagree with us, fine. Well, I'll be willing to debate them any day of the week. But Harrison Butler made a wonderful speech. He didn't put women down. He simply celebrated the idea that if you want to stay at home and take care of your child, you should be able to do so and be a homemaker. And by the way, most women in the United States agree with him. Go read the Gallup poll from a few years ago. They asked women who have children 18 years of age and younger, would you rather be in the workforce or at home working with your child, taking care of them? Most of them wanted to be at home. So that's just a red herring too. But they went after him because he's a Catholic, because he believes in strong Catholic orthodoxy. He's not some right-wing nut. You go read what he's actually said as opposed to what they're saying about him. But they're basically, this is an attempt to silence Butler, but also Benedictine College in Kansas, which is a traditional Catholic school, and it's also aimed at practicing Catholics themselves. There's a bigger agenda here. And some of the incendiary comments that have been made trying to cancel him, they want him fired. A petition wants him fired. That's the left. That's the left in this country. The left in this country hates Jews and they hate Christians, and they're destroying the campuses. And I spent many years as a professor. I know these people very, very well. And that's what their goal is. They want to silence people. The cancel culture is large, and they particularly are going against Catholics and Jews.
So right now, stay with us. We're going to take a very short break, and we'll be back with our excellent panel in just a few short moments. And welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Steve Lance. We're back here with our panel. Arlene, I want to get your thoughts on what we're seeing right now on college campuses in terms of anti-Semitism. You've investigated the media's role as well and how they're playing into this. Tell us where you think we're at right now.
Right now, what I see happening, Steve, is that the administrations at the Ivy League elite colleges are reenacting the 1930s. In the 1930s, when Hitler came to power, some of the administrators and leaders in the Ivy League universities were very eager to invite over some of the Nazi leaders. Now, that did not include Hitler, but they were entertained. They were regaled at beautiful dinners and what have you. Now, some of the students in some of the universities at that time did rise up. Some of them were arrested and jailed, the ones who rose up against the Nazi so-called guests at the invitation of the leaders. Now what we are seeing is a reenactment of this. It's as if this whole covert operation has been going on the university campuses since the 1930s. And of course, in my generation, it has activated and intensified, where now we are here today with what is going on the campuses, where they are enacting Nazi strategies. These crowds, these crazed demonstrators are reenacting what is going on or what did go on in Nazi Germany. So this is very concerning. And one thing I would like to tell all of you on this program and beyond is that one of the great things that is happening on the campuses, there are a number of Christian worship leaders who are going to these campuses and singing praise songs. And I believe a lot of the demonstrators just cannot even comprehend what is going on. But it's a great thing to talk about because there is a remnant that is going to come against these evil doings.
Bill, I want to get your thoughts. The state of Catholics on our college campuses, what is the environment like there for believers?
On college campuses that are not Catholic?
Correct.
Yeah. It's very spotty, and even for that, unfortunately, even on some Catholic campuses, I wonder how Catholic Georgetown is. It has two pro-abortion clubs on the campus, and they have segregated graduation ceremonies for transgender people. So I even have a question there. But there's no question about it. There's a group called FIRE. That's the acronym that studies free speech and what's going on in the campuses, and they found out that Christians in particular were afraid to speak up on a whole range of moral issues, whether it be abortion or transgender rights or gender ideology, whatever it might be. Jews are also careful about what they can say, what they cannot say in defense of Israel. And the people who are leading it, the fight against us, are the ones who consider themselves to be the most tolerant. That's what's really sickening about this. The most intolerant people in the country right now are on the college campuses. I've said on many, many programs before, you have more free speech in your local pub than you do in your local college campus. And that's sad that's true. I spent many years as a college professor, 20 years on the board of directors of the National Association of Scholars. It's a group of Catholics and Jews and Protestants trying to keep the university free. It was founded for one reason, not politics. It wasn't even founded for free speech. It was founded for the pursuit of truth. Now, you can't have the pursuit of truth unless you have a modicum of free speech. And so we're all in favor of that. But what's going on in today's college campuses is nihilism. They've been teaching hatred of Western civilization under the umbrella of multiculturalism for decades. And what you see is what you get. It's no surprise to me. But I live in New York City. It's overwhelmingly Catholic and Jewish. And my Jewish brothers and sisters are being persecuted here now. I can't believe that this is New York City, where Jews have had so much power and influence that they are now being stigmatized and marginalized, as well as their Catholic brothers and sisters who are coming to their defense. It's rather sick.
So, Levi, a lot of people might not realize at our Ivy League institutions here in the United States, they have almost acted as a breeding ground for persecution, CCP persecution, whether it's through the Confucius Institutes, the CSSAs, Chinese Student Scholar Associations. Tell us what you've seen coming out of these groups.
Yeah, I think it's very important what Bill just said, because he's pointing to, I think, what is a systemic failure at a lot of universities to recognize these types of threats, where they're coming from, and take action to actually protect and educate their students. And we just actually last year, we put out a special report on U.S. campuses and talking about Chinese Communist Party infiltration into these campuses. And we looked at well over 40 universities where we found people not only afraid to speak out for human rights of Falun Gong and other types of issues that the communist regime would not appreciate, but actual thuggery, being bullied, and even when it was raised to some of the administration staff, everything from, on the one end, naivete about what was really going on, not understanding that you had forces and proxies of the Chinese regime actually active on campus to try and silence and vilify people there. And then on the other side, complicity, if I may be very direct, about them remaining shoulder to shoulder really with the Chinese regime and their proxies, rather than advocating for the education of the students and the safety of the students. And I think that's one element of what Bill's talking about. You've got a very toxic environment where a lot of this hatred, a lot of this stuff that is either from a foreign communist power or even domestically, is really creating something on our college campuses that's the opposite of what it should be.
Arlene, why is anti-Semitism on the rise and actually being supported in some instances?
I think we've all heard the phrase that Jew hatred, anti-Semitism is one of maybe the oldest group that has been persecuted. And I often say that, it never meets its death. The persecution, the anti-Semitism. So that is one thing that I often think of. But again, I'm going to go back to the social media issue, Steve, because one thing that I find so disturbing, maybe beyond almost anything, all of us understand that Hamas went in to the Gaza envelope. They had on body cams. I will not even try to describe what they did. but they filmed it. And now what we're seeing is so many people worldwide think this is a movie that was made as if they were producers on a film set. This is absolute reality. And then in addition to that, Israel's government press office, they hosted 44,000 journalists from all over the world. They were on the ground in Israel. The government press office toured them to every kibbutz that had been burned and where people had been savaged. They took them to an auditorium and literally showed them some of the footage.
Bill, I want to bring up on the screen and ask you about a letter that you wrote to the president of Northwestern University about the protesters on campus. You said in part, the reason this matters to Catholics as well as to Jews is that it raises the specter of bringing hate mongers to the campus. This is hardly a stretch given the open embrace of Hamas on the part of some of the protesters. So, Bill, is Hamas bringing a religious war to the campuses, all the while denying freedom of religion to Jews and Christians, in your opinion?
Well, yes, exactly. Let's be clear. We're not talking about pro-Palestinian. These people are pro-Hamas, and there is a difference. These people are on the side of the terrorist. And, we have to remember one thing. I'm not going to give the Biden administration a pass here. I know we're focusing on the media, and we should. But they take their cues from on high. The Biden administration is a disgrace. They should be standing with Israel 100% and not telling Bibi what to do and when you can go in there. They're trying to micromanage his military operations. I'm a veteran of the United States Air Force. And I'm also an Irish Catholic. The president's an Irish Catholic. I'm ashamed of him. And the idea that we should compromise on this is giving succor and coverage to all of these people out there who are pro-Hamas. They're on the campuses, they're in the colleges, the universities, and they have been for a long time. But now they're very open about it. And then one of the reasons they are open about it is because they're getting cover from Washington, D.C.
And we're going to leave it right here for just a moment. When we come back, we're going to take a look at who might be driving all of this hate and where it's stemming from. I'm your host, Steve Lance. We'll see you in a moment. And welcome back to International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Steve Lance. We're here with our great guests, Levi Browdy, Bill Donahue, and Arlene Bridges Samuels. It's great to have you all back. Levi, I want to start with you. If you could tell us a little bit more about your investigation into the New York Times and how they've been culpable in assisting China in part of their agenda.
Well, again, we looked at well over 130 articles spanning back a quarter of a century on their coverage of Falun Gong. And what we found is, as I mentioned earlier, a deafening silence for more than 15 years. But we also found from the very beginning this very dangerous and disturbing tendency to follow the CCP's framing and talking points when describing the group they're persecuting, Falun Gong. And that was very disturbing. And it wasn't just sort of the color that they would use, the phraseology they would use. It was just factual errors. Like the CCP would come out and say after maybe the first 3 or 4 months of the persecution started in '99, oh, Falun Gong is crushed. And the New York Times would just parrot that. And you'd have headlines talking about how Falun Gong's been crushed when, the opposite is what's true. 25 years later, there's still tens of millions of people practicing Falun Gong inside China. And yet the New York Times was willing and able to parrot that false statement. And of course, people in the United States are not going to know any difference. They read that and they think, oh, Falun Gong is crushed. So these factual errors, in addition to the omission, the factual errors that they're willing to take from CCP talking points, incorporate that, internalize it into their own reporting, and put that onto the pages of the New York Times, I think is very dangerous for a persecuted group. Certainly.
Arlene, some of these, you have the paper of record we're talking about, the New York Times, and then we have some of these, government organizations, non-government organizations, the United Nations, which is an intra-government organization. Talk to us about specifically the UN's role in how it spreads anti-Semitism.
Well, of course, we understand that it really began in 1947 when the United Nations decided to help create a two-state solution. We understand that the Jewish people accepted it, and of course the Arabs rejected it. So this sort of framework, this kind of mindset has continued for generations now. So the United Nations has increasingly become more and more anti-Semitic. They penalize Israel as a nation and Jews as a people with more lies than they tell about. They don't mention North Korea as much. They don't mention the Islamic regime. Both of North Korea and the Islamic regime are oppressing their own people. So of all the nations in the United Nations, Israel is classically the one that is always blamed for everything. And so this is their stance. This is how they operate. And I have done a good bit of following of the United Nations. And it is unimpressive. It is unhelpful. And of course, our United States has made some good decisions regarding the United Nations when it comes to Israel.
Levi, I have a feeling you might want to weigh in on the UN a little bit, given the fact that China sits on the Security Council and has veto power.
Yeah, I mean, it was a sad and comically comic day many years ago when the Communist China was elevated to the Human Rights Commission. They were sort of overseeing, the human rights work of the UN, and of course, nothing would go through regarding China. So that's a huge problem. And I think, but one of the things I did want to point out is that, these problems are not isolated. The problem that's happening in the Middle East that Arlene's talking about, problems with Catholics and Falun Gong, it's like there are tyrannical regimes. The Chinese Communist regime is one of them that's really looking for opportunities to fuel all this. I mean, if you look at TikTok and what's happening on American campuses, the idea, it's not like you have a highly educated, high amount of knowledge among our college kids about exactly what's happening in the Middle East. It's largely emotional. And where's that emotion coming from? The algorithm of TikTok and other social media platforms where the CCP is specifically targeting and engineering these emotions to whip people up into whatever sort of benefits the Chinese regime, whether it's vilifying Falun Gong or trying to mobilize a bunch of American kids on college campuses to vilify Israel or other parts of the world. And so I think we have to recognize that whether it's the UN, whether it's social media, I mean, this is very much a singular issue. And certain regimes, like the Chinese regime, is behind a lot of it.
So, Bill, on the persecution of Catholics and Christians globally, how dependent is their well-being on the state of faith in the United States?
Well, it is, because the people who are the most concerned about this are the practicing Catholics. They tend to be a bit more orthodox than the non-practicing Catholics. When these polls are taken, they ask you, are you Catholic? Well, there's a profound difference between those who are practicing and those who are not. Those who are not, I no more regard them as Catholic than I do a vegetarian who likes to eat hot dogs every day of the week. So the people abroad, they depend on the people in the pews, the ones who actually pay the bills, who tend to be more orthodox, and to speak up for them. I don't think the Catholics in this country are doing a good enough job. And again, I repeat that the most important Catholic in the United States is the president, who calls himself a devout Catholic. As far as I'm concerned, he's a disgrace to Catholics, and he has a horrible religious liberty record. And you got people being prosecuted today for very minor crimes because they're pro-life. Meanwhile, I live in New York City, people are getting thrown into subways, thrown into cars, people being murdered, and they let them go without bail all the time. Now, our president sets the tone, not just in Washington, but for the United States. But when it comes to religious liberty, this is not a religious friendly person. Look, Trump may not be a religious person in his personal life. I don't know about that, but he doesn't appear to be. I know one thing, his record on religious liberty was excellent. But we don't have a religion-friendly administration in Washington today. We did when Donald Trump was there. His personal relationship and Biden's with God, that's none of my business. It is my business to look at their policies, and their policies were very, very different.
Now, back to the issue of propaganda, misinformation, disinformation that we've all touched on here, whether it's the way the situation in Israel and Gaza is being perceived in the U.S., the persecution that against Falun Gong practitioners that has extended outside of China. Levi, let me ask you, in the propaganda campaigns against Falun Gong practitioners, what are they saying to vilify this group?
Well, domestically inside, really what the real answer to your question is whatever will resonate with their target audience. So, and what's interesting is if you look at the propaganda against Falun Gong, it's quite different or somewhat different domestically inside China from what would work abroad. And that is not by accident. And so inside China, they vilify the faith, they make it look like a weird, strange group, so they scare people to stay away from it. But if you look outside China, they do something, I'll just give you a quick example. They do something that they don't do domestically, and that is one of the things they've tried to convince people is that Falun Gong is racist because we allegedly forbid interracial marriage. Okay, totally ridiculous. If you look at any Falun Gong community around America, there's probably more interracial marriage in that community than most communities. Totally false. But they don't care about that. What they care about is that racism has become an increasingly hot button issue. And so they pick that out and they say, let's formulate some talking points about Falun Gong and racism in America so that we can get a lot of these college kids and everyone else to start hating Falun Gong. And unfortunately, with Falun Gong, unlike other religious groups, it's not very well known in America. And so that stuff has more and more traction. And so here we find ourselves in America being called something that's a complete lie that they don't talk about inside China, but does have an increasing amount of traction. There was even a line in the New York Times a few years ago that talked about this. And if you trace it all the way back to the source, if you look at the New York Times article and what they referenced, it goes back to the English language website of the Chinese consulate in Chicago. That's where this line comes from. And so I think that's sort of the anatomy of what propaganda from the Chinese regime looks like as it's manufactured and tried to be sold here in the United States.
Arlene, I want to get your thoughts on Goebbels' propaganda during the campaign against Jews in Nazi Germany and how it isolated the Jewish people and some of the similar instances we're seeing right now.
Well, once Goebbels took over, after Hitler won his seat, so to speak, he was in charge of every single aspect of media. And so they began their campaign poisoning the minds of the German church. And the German church did not rise up in the same way that we would wish today, because they accepted a lot of the Nazi propaganda. They hung Nazi flags in their churches. They welcomed Nazis into their congregations. And of course, we know that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the wonderful, brilliant German theologian, stood up against them and ended up being hung in Flossenburg right before the Allies came and freed the Jewish people. They hung him because of his standing against Hitler. So we have a lot of background of this, but I think that one thing I wanted to mention that's extremely important, part of the groundwork, it's not just Hitler in the 1930s and 40s. Of course, that was the most horrific time. We don't have to go into everyone understands this who has any kind of love for truth. But this happened also within the Palestinian community when Yasser Arafat took over in the Palestinian community. He was an excellent propagandist. And so he used a lot of the same sorts of things that Goebbels implemented, the terrible cartoons, portraying Jews as those who wanted to kill Jewish children for their blood to celebrate at Passover. I mean, these sorts of things that Goebbels kept repeating over and over again, and repetitiveness was an important part of what the Nazi strategy was. So it was very intimidating to everyone, including the Christian community who could see what was going on, but they didn't stand up enough with Bonhoeffer. And what we need today is the Bonhoeffer generation to stand up against the strategies that the boycott, divest, and sanction movement has implemented since 2005, when some of a currently imprisoned Palestinian leader thought it up. And now on the college campuses, all of the young people
Arlene,
are accepting
we're gonna
their
just
propaganda.
Arlene, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to find out what can people of faith do to combat this uphill battle that they seem to be facing across the globe. And welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Steve Lance. We're back with our excellent panel, Levi Browdy, Arlene Bridges-Samuels, and Bill Donahue. It's so great. This has been an excellent discussion. Bill, I want to get your thoughts right now in the midst of all of what seems to be this chaos around the world and our country. What can people of faith do to resist what seems to be this onslaught of challenges facing them?
They have to exercise courage. Let me give you an example. And they not only have to talk to the people within their own faith community, they have to go outside their own faith community. Look, people of different faiths obviously have different theological understandings, but there's an awful lot that we have in common culturally speaking. You mentioned there before, Steve, that I wrote a letter to the president of Northwestern University. I stood up for my Jewish brothers and sisters. Why are we bringing Palestinian professors in? We know what they are. They're going to be pro-Hamas. The response I got from Jews is amazing. I have to say, Jews are much better than Catholics when it comes to thanking people and showing gratitude for what you've done. I've worked with Jewish leaders. New York is largely Catholic and Jewish on a number of different occasions. We have to be willing to exercise courage. There's too much reticence, too much diffidence, too much cowardice, quite frankly, in a lot of the faith communities. We got to buck up, people.
Levi, tell us, what are Falun Dafa practitioners both inside of China right now, still undergoing persecution, doing to resist this persecution, as well as overseas Falun Gong practitioners?
Well, inside China for more than 20 years, there's been what is the largest civil disobedience movement in world history, actually, where tens of millions of Falun Gong practitioners, usually under cover of night, have been creating underground, essentially media, neat leaflets, newsletters, and distributing them to their neighborhood, their communities all around China. And that's had a tremendous effect that requires, as Bill just said, courage, first and foremost, courage. And I think overseas, we need the courage that Bill is talking about. And I think one important thing to realize is that the volume of rhetoric doesn't always equal the volume of people. I think we have people of faith, you have to understand that there is a large majority out there, predominantly silent, that are with us. And I think that should actually give us some of the courage that Bill's talking about, because just because you hear a lot of people screaming about something, that doesn't equal the amount of people that actually feel that way. And I think there's a lot of people of faith out there, and we should have the courage overseas to, like the Falun Gong practitioners inside China, stand up and give a voice to this issue.
Arlene,
You're totally right.
Arlene, what is your message to, say, Jewish students on American college campuses who may be questioning whether they want to return to Columbia University or Yale University, where they have to walk into a classroom in such a hostile environment?
Well, honestly, I think some of it has to do with the parents making the right decisions on behalf of their students. So my advice to them would be to have these family conversations. And I think, too, that the Jewish students, I hope that they are sensing and seeing Christian students standing with them, because there is a great number, millions of us Christians, who are not only praying, but we are acting. And this is what I write about continually. Christians, we have to pray, but we must enact humanitarian aid toward Israel, but we must, as Christians, wherever we can, stand particularly with the Jewish students and the Jewish people, because Judaism birthed the Christian faith. We would not have a faith if it were not for the Jews and Judaism and the one that we in the Christian community call our Jewish Lord Jesus.
Bill, how can people of faith turn the tide? Is it worth, reaching out to the media, starting more dialogue, speaking to members of Congress?
Well, yes, certainly with Congress. I spent my whole life in the media. It's more corrupt now than ever before, and by corrupt I mean that they're ideologically gone. They're so. Listen, I used to do Fox and MSNBC and CNN for years, and quite frankly, what's happened at CNN and MSNBC, they don't have conservative voices on, and they haven't had them for a number of years. It's really so far gone. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they're speaking monotone. Fortunately, we do have the internet. We have Epoch Times. We have alternative media. We do have all other voices out there. And the average American has to seek out and find more reliable voices because they themselves don't trust the big media anymore. And that's a good sign. Just because you have an alphabet after your name, too, and you're a doctor so-and-so, I have a PhD, so what? Some of the craziest people I've ever met in my life are ones with the PhDs. You got to be careful. Trust your gut. If somebody's saying something which sounds wacky, it probably is.
Levi, I want to get your thoughts. What type of support and reaction have you seen from our Congress and the United States government with relation specifically to this persecution of Falun Gong practitioners in China?
Well, I think the big difference has been over the last 6 or 7 years when people first started to realize, China and the CCP are not the same thing. These are two very different things. And that awareness really created many different positive changes, and one of which was more awareness about persecution of Falun Gong, persecution of underground Christians and other groups inside China, but also just the looming threat of the CCP overall, because before that, I think there wasn't enough awareness about just how many different ways the CCP has reached out for influence and manipulation here in the United States. And I think, again, coming back to the college campuses and the emotions that are flaming up there, part of that is CCP influence. And so I think, generally speaking, there is a greater awareness of CCP influence in this country, and that's a good thing. That needs to increase a lot more, but we're heading in the right direction.
Arlene, if you could talk to us about maybe certain glimmers of hope that you have actually seen amidst all of what seems to be this uphill battle that we're speaking about.
I would love to comment on that. It's one thing that has happened since 10/7 is that so many Christians have gone to Israel despite the war, despite they have laid aside their fears. They have gone to Israel and implemented all kinds of humanitarian aid. I don't know what the current estimates are, and I'm not sure anyone has them, but I dare say that millions and millions of dollars have been donated to various entities in Israel to help the Israeli people through this terrible time that they're going through. The entire nation has been overcome with a national trauma that is going to take many years to come out from. Having said that, they still are a people who love life and give us examples of how to endure. And we Christians can learn a lot from them about how they act on living life in the best way possible in the worst circumstances.
Bill, can you share with us anything that you're heartened to see?
Yeah, on the college campuses, all these kids praising America, singing the national anthem. Some of them are fraternity guys. Others are just simply kids who are just fed up with this. They need to be more vocal. I mean, both of the guests are perfectly right. It's a minority that's really dominating. They have the microphone. Even when Jerry Seinfeld, who did nothing incendiary whatsoever, they had students walking out at Duke University. Most of the students, remember, were there. And a lot of them were praising him and screaming, Jerry, Jerry. So, but the silent majority can't be silent in the face of this kind of pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, anti-American and anti-Israel kind of situation. And, we're going to take a break over the summer, but who only knows? You've got the Republicans in Milwaukee, you've got the Democrats in Chicago in July and August, respectively, and the outside agitators, and they're quite active. They're going to be in the streets, and they're going to be out there against Jews. And I think more and more people, Jews and Christians and Protestants, have to stand together, bring in the Muslims, bring in everybody. This has to stop, and we have to hold up a big stop sign and not be afraid.
Levi, are you hopeful that things may have reached the extreme and that things are turning around?
You know, I had a close family member call me after, several weeks after October 7. And this is a family member I've been telling them about for years about the influence of CCP on our media and controlling the narrative. And obviously what happened on that day was horrific. But if there was a silver lining that I could see, it was this family member for the first time looked at that and looked at how it was being covered in the media and some of the things they're being talking about Hamas and the way it was framed. And they said to me, I get it. I now see what you've been talking about narratives that are wrong, narratives that are vilifying peaceful people have infiltrated our media. And I think that's an anecdote, just one personal instance, but I think it tells a much broader picture. I think that story of my family member is true of many, many, many Americans, where they're starting to see more clearly the damage that some of the media has done and the difference between the world they're trying to paint and the world as it really is.
I really want to thank everybody for today's discussion. It was really substantive, important, and most of all, I think, taking away from it, inspiring this last bit of our talk. Levi Braude, Arlene Samuels, and Bill Donohue, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to all of you brave reporters out there honoring the journalist's golden rule, seek the truth and report it. Thank you. I'm Steve Lance. Thank you so much for joining us on NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. Until next time.